Michelle Graff, welcome to the Human Capital Innovations Podcast.
Hi, glad to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining me. I'm super excited to have a nice conversation with you today. We're going to be focusing on cultivating resilience among our team and juxtaposing that with this idea of the compassion fatigued organization, which is the title of your recent book. I'm super excited to explore that with you. As we get started, I wanted to share Michelle's bio with everybody. Michelle Graff is the founder of Cultivating Human Resiliency and the author of Compassion Fatigued Organization. After more than 20 years in social services, she now focuses on helping the helping professional, on helping she now focuses on helping the helping professional. As a resiliency cultivator, she provides training and consultation to both public and private human service agencies. Over the past 22 years, Michelle has developed and presented hundreds of trainings on everything from trauma and the brain to interpersonal and leadership skills. Her experience working with human service professionals and organizations has provided an insider's perspective on the impact of secondary trauma. Compassion fatigue has become her most requested topic. I'm super excited to explore that with you. Thanks for joining me. And before we really launch on into the conversation, anything else you would like to share with listeners by way of background or personal context?
No, I think other than just to say, since I started out actually as a service provider, working in a social service organization, we had a lot of focus on understanding trauma and how it affects people for the purpose of better serving our clientele. And one of the things I noticed was that all of the things we were learning applied to ourselves as providers, and that we're not that different. All human beings, when we talk about being trauma informed, it's not about just understanding the traumatized. It's about understanding all of us and our brain's responses to different stressors or threats. And the information we learned is applicable to everybody. I also realized that it's all about connection and human interaction, and to provide those compassionate connections to people, which is really where healing begins. We need to ourselves be compassionate and understand how our experiences impact our interpersonal responses. So that's what sort of inspired me to change my focus to the helping provider.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I appreciate that additional context about how you kind of switched your focus as you've gone throughout your career. So let's talk. Let's start by talking about the compassion fatigued organization. That's the title of your book. Um, what was the inspiration behind that book, and tell us a little bit about what you mean by the compassion fatigued organization.
Sure. Well, as in my job as a resiliency cultivator, I provide a lot of trainings on a variety of topics. And two helping organizations are my primary clients or customers. And I noticed that I was getting a lot of requests for compassion fatigue as a topic. And this was pre-pandemic. It just seemed to be something everybody was interested in. And it's not a new topic. The concepts of compassion fatigue have been around for a while. But as I started presenting the topics, I was also delving more into what does this really mean? How do we really combat it? And it's not just about the individual, it's also about the organization. Because when we talk about interpersonal relationships, that that applies to our organizations as well as individuals, and it's all about, I do a lot of work with understanding the brain, and the brain is just sort of a model of our interpersonal relationships, the way the brain functions, and that is also sort of a model for our organizations. So as I was delving deeper into the topic, recognizing that there was a great need out there, that sort of guided my decision to make that the topic of my book, just because I thought there was a need. And this was, I started writing pre-pandemic, and then of course this last year or year and a half has really emphasized the need for caregivers or people in the helping profession to really be able to look at how do we take care of them and how do they take care of themselves? Not just take care of themselves, but how do we take care of each other?
Yeah, yeah. And so this idea of compassion fatigue, um, as I think about this past year, we've really needed people to show more empathy, to show more compassion. We need leaders to listen to their people, to understand the challenges they're facing, and that does wear on you over time.
Hmm.
And leaders bear a heavy burden. And one thing that I've talked to many executives about in coaching and in various conversations this past year is how they're expected to carry that load for their people, but who's carrying that load for them?
Right.
Who's showing them that compassion? Who's listening to their struggles? They're having all the same issues that the rest of us are having, right? And it does wear on you over time as you're trying to, support. Say I have a family, I have kids at home, and they're doing online school, and you and your spouse are working remotely, and you have a remote team, and you're trying to help them, and they're all struggling. I mean, man, it's a heavy burden. It's a hard thing to deal with, and burnout is inevitable at some point if you
Hmm.
don't practice self-care and make sure that you're taking care of your own needs.
Absolutely. And I think it's also about understanding what's actually going on when we experience compassion fatigue. You are right in pointing out that it's not just the traditional helping professional. This is something that impacts a lot of us. And I think leaders are a unique group in that way because compassionate leaders, which we hope, we have compassionate leaders, they're going to be exposed to the all of the trauma, if they're empathetic, everything that their staff and their workforce is going through. And when we talk about compassion fatigue, it's that experience that feels like you're out of compassion. You just you're depleted. And one of the things that I try to stress in the book is that compassion is a renewable resource. We're really not out of compassion. What's happening is our brain is recognizing that the compassionate work we do um, makes us vulnerable. And so it's shutting it down. It's a protective response to start numbing those feelings of compassion because our brain is detecting that as a threat. And so the answer to doing that or to combating it is actually not to be less compassionate, not to pull away as our instincts might tell us to do, but actually reset, set some boundaries, and keep compassion going in our lives. And so that's where my book, I try to offer some practical ways of doing that. And one of the ways, I always say start with yourself in your own understanding and self-awareness. So I use an analogy to describe compassion fatigue as the circuit breaker in our house. And Jonathan, I'm sure you've experienced, as your listeners have, times where you've accidentally tripped that breaker. And if you didn't understand the workings of a house and you're trying to make dinner and you have all these appliances going and all of a sudden the power shuts off, your first response might be to think that you're now depleted of power, that the power's run out somehow. But of course, we know that's not what is going on at all. You've just tripped a circuit breaker, and that's a safety feature in your house. It means the wires are, overloaded somewhat, and the breaker trips so that you can be safe. And what you need to do is unplug a few things and go reset that breaker and get that power back going. And so that's a great analogy, I think, to help people understand what's going on with their stress response or their threat response in their brain when they're experiencing compassion fatigue. You're not out of compassion. In fact, compassion's the antidote. But you also need to reset. So we talk a lot about self-regulation and learning some ways to regulate, sort of restore that sense of safety. and then be able to continue to practice compassionate connections and compassionate interactions in the context of some skill sets that help us to do that safely.
Yeah, and you mentioned boundaries, and I think that is really important, and particularly in social work, for example, so many social workers burn out because it wears at you, right? And so unless you're able to reset, unless you're able to compartmentalize and set up boundaries, it's inevitable at some point. And I think that's true for a compassionate leader, a really concerned parent. Like, we have to be able to set up those boundaries. So what are some of the specific things you suggest to readers in your book, or people you work with in organizations, on how to set up those healthy boundaries?
Well, boundaries in themselves it's a very complex, because we have boundaries in so many different things. We have information boundaries, emotional boundaries. It's not just the physical boundaries. So we always start by identifying or recognizing what those boundaries are and what we need. And our boundaries are very personal. What I need to feel safe and to function properly might be different than, Jonathan, what you need in a relationship. And boundaries vary from relationship to relationship. So we talk about, I first have them identify the different relationship areas, not necessarily specific people, but you have different relationships for your coworkers, perhaps, or your family or your customers, and to identify those different relationship types. And then what do you need from that relationship in terms of what do you need to function effectively, but also safely? So what are you willing to do? What are you not willing to do? What are you willing to share? What are you not willing to share? And kind of outline that. And then also recognizing that boundaries are two ways. It's not just about us not allowing our boundaries to be crossed. We need to be careful about crossing boundaries of other people, because we can't just assume everybody has the same boundaries as I do or you do. So really just starting with that self-awareness and really being able to clearly identify. I always say healthy boundaries, it's not about loose or tight. Sometimes we associate loose boundaries with being bad boundaries or tight, and that's not the case at all. It doesn't matter where we are on that continuum, as long as it keeps us safe. What matters is that we can affectionately function in relationships, that we can be safe, and that they are clearly identified. So that means really getting down to understanding what my boundaries are so I can communicate them clearly to other people. Most people in this world struggle with this. We're all on a continuum of hurt and healing. And sometimes if we're on the hurt end of that continuum, our boundaries might look messy. They're not clearly defined. And so when we bump up against someone like that, we're going to get a interpersonal response that's going to be a protective response. And then that might trigger us. And our responses then might be another protective response. And the better we can have established the boundaries, the more easily, not only can we communicate them, but we can recognize when we're doing one of those protective responses in our relationships. And we can stop and say, oh, wait a minute. Did I just have my boundary crossed, or did I just cross somebody else's boundary, and how I responded to that? So that's sort of a complicated response to a complicated question, but it really starts with that self-awareness.
Yeah, well, I love that response, and we don't need to pretend like something is more simple than it is. That just causes more problems. But I think that's really helpful, and we need to be thoughtful about our boundaries. We need to take the time to really consider them and consider the different types of relationships we have, and find, everyone's different in how their energy works and how they become depleted as they go throughout their day, right? And so what works for me and like what boundaries I need, probably are going to be a little bit different than you or, 10 other people that I meet walking down the street. And that's totally fine. So we just need to learn about ourselves. We need to learn about how our energy flow works, the challenges that we may face when we're going about our day. And then we can, over time, experiment, investigate, and try things out and see how it pans out for us.
Yeah. Relationships are hard. Any interpersonal relationship, whether it be professional or personal, they're challenging. All of us, and you can get better at it, but there's no easy formula. We're human beings. We're going to be triggered at times. We're going to respond in a way that we recognize as, oh, that wasn't helpful at all. And, the best we can do is repair and grow and learn from it and continue on with our relationships. But it's an ongoing skill set that we're all learning. And so it has to come with some humility and also the ability to forgive, or just recognize the humility in other people, or the humanity in others.
Yeah, that's a great reminder. So let's talk now a little bit more about resilience. We're facing compassion fatigue. We all have our traumas. We all have our pain points and the challenges we face, as you mentioned. So what do we do about it? Like, how do we respond to it? And I love the word resilience, because I think there's so much embedded there about how we can approach, really our worldview, how we approach our interactions with others as we go about our day. So what are some of the things you share with clients as you're talking about how to foster more of a resilience mindset to respond to those challenges we face?
Well, I like to I talk a lot about mindsets, but not just mindsets. That's sort of our cognitive response, but also understanding our emotions and being able to recognize them, and also our body responses, as well as our interpersonal relationship responses. Those 4 things are really important. And when I talk about resiliency, I talk about that area between fight and flight and freeze. Because we can be triggered in 2 different responses: that response of mobilization, that response of freeze or immobilization. And in between that is healthy regulation. Now, that doesn't mean that when we're responding in mobilization, it's all fight and flight. You can be mobilized in a way that we respond that isn't necessarily triggering a protective response. For example, we don't want to be at rest all the time. A little bit of stress in our life is good. It motivates us to get things done, to accomplish things. And also, even emotionally, that's where courage lies. When we're mobilized, but we still, we have to face something that's challenging, but we're not triggered into being frozen or over responding or in a way that's distorted. So I take a look at that in all 4 of those areas I mentioned. So in terms of mindsets, recognizing what does fight and flight look like in a mindset? Well, that's our protective response in all the distortion, learning about how our brain distorts things in order to keep us safe when we're threatened, but recognizing when we're applying that distorted thinking to situations that it's no longer helping us. We're not being threatened right now, and it's keeping us from being a critical thinker. Or on the other end of that continuum is denial or dissociation. When are we triggered into just sort of blocking it out and not thinking? And how do we keep ourselves regulated? So resiliency comes in the practices, whether they be cognitive practices or, the regulation practices, as well as the things that we practice over time that builds our skill set so that we broaden that middle band where we can stay regulated, both emotionally, cognitively, and within our interpersonal relationships. And we're not being driven by those protective survival responses.
I really love that. And I think the fight or flight response, our survival response, it's baked into us, right? It's just part of our hard wiring, and so we need to learn we can how we can get past the survival response, in terms of taking care of ourselves and our relationships with others. I think that's all super important. And I love the word resilience. I love the idea that, you know, we can choose how we're going to respond to challenges that we face. Um, we all come from different backgrounds. We have different stuff that we have to deal with. We have different levels of privilege or lack thereof. Um, I'm a middle-aged white dude. I say that a lot on this podcast. I'm straight. Like, I have a lot of privilege, but that doesn't mean I don't have challenges, that I don't have hardships, that I don't have emotional trauma. I do, just like everybody else, but mine looks different than others, and I don't have to face some of the same systemic challenges that others have to face, right? But I can recognize that. I can then learn how I can respond to the types of unique situations I face. And then I can learn how I can better support others who might face different challenges. And so that we can all collectively have more of a resilience mindset, and be more proactive about how we respond to those difficult things in our lives.
Yes. Yes. And it's the wonderful thing. The thing I like the most about the work I'm doing, it's not about pathology. It's about being human. And we all get triggered, every one of us. And yes, you are correct. And our past experiences certainly shape how we respond. I believe the experiences of our parents and grandparents shape how we respond. But each interaction that we face, we have an opportunity to respond differently and to learn and grow from that. But part of learning and growing is also being able to acknowledge that you're human and accept that you are going to make mistakes,
Yeah.
and kind of be able to get past the emotions that come with that too.
Yeah.
So that we can fix we can heal, we can focus on healing and restoration, as opposed to guilt and
Yeah.
things that are unhelpful.
Yep, perfect. Well, Michelle, it has been a real pleasure talking with you today. The time has flown by. We're about to the end of our time, but before we close, I wanted to give you a chance to share with listeners how they can get connected with you, find out more about your work, your team, and then give us the final word on the topic for today.
Okay. Well, I have a website called Resiliency, or it's resiliencyonline.com. That's a good way to connect with me. I also, Cultivating Human Resiliency has a Facebook page and a YouTube account. And so if you Google Cultivating Human Resiliency, you can find me there. And also, my book is available on Amazon.com, and it is the Compassion Fatigued Organization, Restoring Compassion to Helping Professionals. And that's available if you want to look for that. And also, you can, if you go to my website or Facebook page or any of the other social media accounts, you'll be able to find more information also about my book. And I also, what I really, my big work, I'm more than just an author. I work with organizations, and I love working with leaders. I provide trainings online, as well as, before the pandemic, I did workshops in person, and hopefully someday we'll get back to those. But, I'm available to help organizations also in this or anything, compassion fatigue, or anything that has to do with resiliency, being trauma informed. The brain is one of my favorite topics to talk about. And I am not a neuroscientist, but I like to find practical ways to apply the research to the work that we do.
Yeah, yeah, perfect. Well, thank you, Michelle. It has really been a pleasure. I encourage listeners to reach out, to get connected, to find out more about what you can do for them. Check out your book, check out your service offerings. And as always, I hope everyone can stay healthy and safe, that you can find meaning and purpose at work each and every day. And I hope you all have a great week.